Hi everyone, welcome back to the final recording of this topic. And in this part, we're going to cover the following objectives. So be able to summarize glucose homeostasis, discuss lipid and protein metabolism, discuss the importance of vitamins and minerals, define the terms metabolic rate and basal metabolic rate and state how metabolic rates are expressed. Explain the relationship between body weight and energy intake, output, and balance. And finally, describe the mechanisms for regulating blood or food intake. In terms of homeostasis of blood glucose levels, remember that this is under hormonal control and predominantly the hormones insulin and glucagon from the pancreas. Of course, there are other ones like cortisol that are involved, but we're just going to talk about these ones. Okay, so homeostasis of blood glucose levels. Homeostasis anywhere between 70 to 110 milligrams per deciliter there is normal. So when, your blood glucose levels start to dip, that low blood glucose is going to be registered and those alpha cells, will release glucagon. So blood glucose decreases below sort of 80 to 90, then you sort of enter this fasting state. The liver cells increase catabolism of glycogen and amino acids and glycerol. And what you end up with then is, a breakdown of glycogen is glycogenolysis, and gluconeogenesis is the formation of new glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, so amino acids and glucose. So they're all released into the blood, and that brings the blood level back up to normal ranges. Blood glucose levels then obviously increase as well after a meal. And in normal sort of regulation, the liver cells increase the removal rate of glucose molecules from the blood. So glucose, chains of glucose molecules form glycogen, and that's that short-term storage, and that's called glycogenesis, as we talked about earlier. At higher levels, though, glucose is converted to fat in the liver, and then at even higher levels, say somebody's got uncontrolled diabetes, that glucose then is excreted in the urine. And this is just summarizing what I mentioned. Just remember the beta cells secrete the insulin, the alpha cells in the pancreas produce and release or secrete the glucagon. Okay, so there are, many other hormones that do control glucose metabolism. For example, we have the incretins. These are gastrointestinal hormones. Glucagon-like peptide 1 or GLP-1 is an example, as is gastric inhibitory peptide or GIP. And these both affect pancreatic cells. So they increase insulin release and decrease glucagon release to reduce the blood glucose levels. So these incretins are released when blood glucose levels are high, so after a meal. Now, GLP-1, you probably may have heard of a drug called Ozempic or semaglutide, and that is one of these GLP-1 like kind of agonists, okay? So what does that mean? It means it's a drug that has the same effect as this endogenous GLP-1. So some of the things it does is it reduces gastric emptying so that food stays longer in the stomach. They also increase the secretion of insulin from the beta cells in the pancreas. And they also reduce food intake, they reduce appetite, and they reduce the feeling, of being hungry. And so they have been, prescribed for people with diabetes because of the high blood glucose levels, but many people now are taking them, for weight loss. And they also seem to reduce the chances of things like cardiovascular disease, but they have lots of different sort of side effects. If you think, they're acting on the digestive tract, so there's going to be lots of side effects there. Some people are also getting kidney damage from the use of Ozempic. as well. The stress hormones as well will sort of influence blood glucose levels. If you think of the fight or flight response, you need to have an increase in blood glucose levels, and adrenaline in acute stress will do this, and cortisol with chronic stress will do that. And that's kind of the problem with cortisol and chronic stress. It can lead to cortisol-induced diabetes because of that consistent sort of increase in blood glucose levels. Growth hormone too also influences blood glucose levels because it kind of causes the shifting from carbohydrate to fat catabolism, and that helps to preserve glucose for use by the neurons. So neurons need, a constant delivery of glucose in the plasma. And finally, thyroid hormones have very complex effects on metabolism. Okay, so we're going to move on now to dietary sources of lipids. So we have triglycerides, phospholipid, and cholesterol. With the triglycerides, this is the most common lipid. It's composed of a glycerol subunit attached to 3 fatty acids. And these are found in dietary fats, so saturated, mainly of animal origin. So these tend to be solid, and that's why we call them animal fats. And then unsaturated ones, mainly plant origin, and this is why we call them vegetable oils. Okay, and an example then of an unsaturated vegetable oil would be virgin olive oil, which contains about 95% monounsaturated fatty. Phospholipid then is an important lipid found in all foods, but in particular eggs and liver and lean meats and cereal grains and oil seeds. And then cholesterol, of course, is an important lipid, and it's found only in animal origin foods. Remember that cholesterol is needed to build the structure of plasma membranes. All the steroid hormones are based on cholesterol, so and the reproductive hormones like estrogen and testosterone. And also, we need cholesterol for metabolism to work efficiently. For example, cholesterol is needed to make active vitamin D. In terms then of lipid metabolism, we have anabolism again and catabolism. With anabolism, we're talking about the synthesis of triglycerides, cholesterol, phospholipids, and prostaglandins as well. Remember, they're those, mediators, chemical signals that are mediators of inflammation, but they have a huge sort of housekeeping role to play in the body. And one of the things that prostaglandins do is to promote that thick mucus that lines the stomach. Catabolism then is the breakdown of triglycerides to release fatty acids and glycerol, or the breakdown of glycerol to produce glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, which then enters the glycolysis pathway. Fatty acids via beta oxidation produces acetyl-CoA. And when you compare the energy that is released from 1 gram of fat compared to 1 gram of carbohydrate, you can see that it is more than twice, so 9 kilocalories of heat. Moving on now to the dietary sources of proteins. And remember, that proteins are assembled from a pool of many different amino acids, and our bodies synthesize amino acids from other compounds in the body. Only about half the necessary types of amino acids can be produced by the body. So there are these 9 amino acids that are termed essential amino acids, and they have to be obtained from the diet. Now, it's not necessary for you to know the names of the 9 amino acids, but they are histidine, isoleucine, leucine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, tryptophan, and valine. And the sources, of course, of protein in our diet are animal products, so lean meat in particular, and vegetables and legumes and nuts as well. Protein anabolism and protein catabolism also occurs as part of protein metabolism. With anabolism here, where proteins are being synthesized by the ribosomes of different cells. With protein catabolism, this involves deamination. Now, remember what deamination is. It takes place firstly in hepatocytes, And remember, proteins are nitrogenous based, and one of the waste products is ammonia. And remember, ammonia is very toxic, and it's converted to urea and excreted in urine. And the other sort of product that forms is a keto acid molecule as well. We also need vitamins and minerals in our diet. Vitamins are organic molecules necessary for normal metabolism. They may aid in the work of enzymes or play other important biochemical roles. Coenzymes are organic non-protein catalysts that often act as molecule carriers. And many enzymes and coenzymes are useless unless the appropriate vitamin attaches to them and gives them the shape that allows them, to function properly. We also need vitamins in our diet. Now, these are organic molecules that are necessary for normal metabolism. They may aid in the work of enzymes or play other important biochemical roles. Vitamin D, we've talked about that one quite a bit, increases calcium intake from the GI tract, and vitamin C increases iron intake. Most vitamin molecules attach to enzymes or coenzymes, and coenzymes are non-protein catalysts that often act as molecule carriers. And many enzymes and coenzymes are useless unless they have a vitamin attached to them, and that gives them the shape then to be able to function properly. Now, most of the necessary vitamins are not produced by the body and must be obtained through the diet. And our bodies can store fat-soluble vitamins in the liver, but not water-soluble vitamins. So say vitamin C. Minerals then are inorganic elements or salts found in the earth. They also attach to enzymes and help them function in chemical reactions. They're essential for fluid and ion composition of the internal fluid environment, and they're involved in many processes in the body. Now, this is all going to make sense to you now because we're talking about magnesium, calcium, sodium, and chlorine. And they're involved in muscle contraction, nerve function, hardening of the bone, pH homeostasis, facilitating enzyme action, transport, for hemoglobin, transporting oxygen, and the immune system. Zinc is very important in the immune system. Too large or too small an amount of some minerals may be harmful, and depending on our age, we might need to take in more or less of a particular mineral over the lifespan. For example, calcium is important there for growing bones, and also for females when they're pregnant. So they would have to up their intake of that. And this figure here is just showing you calcium intake in females, but over the lifespan there. Okay, so we're going to move on now to metabolic rate, which is the amount of energy released by catabolism. So the metabolic rate is the energy that must be expended to accomplish various kinds of work. So in short, the metabolic rate is the catabolic rate, or the rate of energy release. The basal metabolic rate then, which is your BMR, is the rate of energy expended under basal conditions, under resting conditions. This varies between individuals due to their size, their body composition, their gender, their age, their thyroid hormone levels, because remember, thyroid hormone regulates your basal metabolic rate, your body temperature, any kind of medications that you might be taking, and also genetics as well. We often hear of, families with really high metabolic rates compared to other families with low metabolic rates. And metabolic rates are expressed in two different ways: the number of kilocalories of heat energy expended per day, or per hour. And this figure down here just kind of summarizes all of those different factors that I mentioned up here, but also you have feeding into, they feed into the metabolic rate, which also contributes to the total metabolic rate. But feeding into the total metabolic rate as well are things like the environmental temperature, the food intake, and also the exercise that the person is doing, and all kinds of muscular activity. Okay, what about energy balance and body weight? So your body weight is stable So in a state of energy balance, when the total calories in food ingested, so the energy input, is equal to the total metabolic rate. The body weight increases when the energy input is greater than the energy output, and the energy output is the total metabolic rate expressed in kilocalories. Body weight decreases then when the energy input is less than the energy output. Kind of makes sense, right? In starvation, carbohydrates are used up first, then fats, and then proteins. And glycogen stores are depleted, by 1 to 2 days. So what that means is, if there's no food intake for a couple of days, those glycogen stores are depleted. Okay, and very finally, mechanisms for regulating food intake. So the hypothalamus in the brain plays a huge part in food intake. The appetite centers in the hypothalamus exert the primary control over food intake. So neurons in the hypothalamus, when they're stimulated, that's going to bring on an increase in appetite. The feeding center has these orexigenic effects, and what that means is just increasing food intake. And factors other sort of areas in the brain are the satiety center, and they have anorexigenic effect. So that means that when these neurons are stimulated, it's going to decrease the appetite. So these are factors that suppress appetite. Anorexia is a loss of appetite. And these are regulated by a whole plethora of hormones that also influence energy expenditure, including ghrelin, which is secreted by the stomach when it is empty, and it induces that feeling of hunger. And leptin then, which is secreted by adipose tissue, and leptin then increases or induces satiety. So just to finish up, for many decades we thought that adipose tissue was not a dynamic tissue, but now we know that it secretes about more than 50 different hormones, and one of these is leptin, that kind of is secreted after we've eaten a meal, and it kind of stimulates the satiety center to tell us that we're feeling full, so that we don't go and eat again. Unfortunately, in states of obesity, where there's too much adipose tissue, all of that hormonal kind of signaling from the adipose tissue goes a bit kind of out of whack, and the leptin signals sometimes don't work. Okay, everybody, we have reached the end of this topic.